Hi, welcome again to Reading with Nana. We're continuing with our story entitled Heidi by Johanna Spyri, and we're in chapter 1. So far, we know that Heidi is 5 years old, her mother has died, and her aunt is taking her to the mountains to live with her grandfather, who is known as Uncle in the town because everybody in the town is sort of related. But his reputation is he's mean, he's grumpy, everybody's afraid of him. And in their opinion, there is no place to take a child. He lives up there alone with 2 goats, and he comes to town once a year to get, whatever supplies he needs. And we know by the story that she doesn't live in the United States. We'll get to where she lives later. We left off, Data was telling Barbara why or what she knows about her grandfather's attitude. But what happened to Tobias, his son? Just wait. How can I tell you everything at once? Exclaimed Data. Tobias was an apprentice in Mills. He was a carpenter. When he became a master craftsman, he came back to the village and married my sister, Adelheid. They had always been fond of each other, and they lived very happily as man and wife. But alas, their joy soon ended. 2 years after they married, as Tobias was building a house, a beam fell on him and killed him. Then Adelheid was thrown into a violent fever out of grief and fright, and she never recovered from it. She had never been very healthy, and she had often suffered from strange spells. Where did we know whether she was awake or asleep? Only a few weeks after Tobias's death, they buried poor Adelheid. People began to speak about the uncle as if God were punishing him for his misdeeds. After the death of his son, he never spoke to a living soul. He abruptly moved to the Alps, and there he lives at enmity with God and man. My mother and I took Adelaide's little year-old baby, Heidi, to live with us. When I moved to Ragaz, I took her with me. But in the spring, the family from Frankfurt decided to take me to their house in the city. I'm very glad to get such a good position. And now you want to hand over that girl to this terrible old man? I really wonder how you could do such a thing, Data, said Barbara, with reproach in her voice. It seems to me I have really done enough for the child. I do not know where else to take her, and she is too young to come with me to Frankfurt. By the way, Barbara, how far will you go with us? We are halfway up the Alm already. Data shook hands with her companion and stood there while Barbara approached the tiny, dark brown mountain hut, which lay in a hollow a few steps from the path. Situated halfway up the Alm, the cottage was nicely protected from the mighty winds. Had it been exposed to the tempest, it would have been a hazardous dwelling given the state of decay it was in. As it was, the doors and windows rattled, and the old rafters shook when the south wind blew down the mountainside. If the hut had stood on the Alm top, the wind would have blown it clear down the valley during the storm season. Here lived Peter, the goat herd, an 11-year-old boy. It was his daily duty to collect the goats from the village and drive them up the mountains to feed them on the luscious green pastures. Peter would race down the slope in the evening with the light-footed little goats. When he whistled a thrill blast through his fingers, the owners would come out and get their goats. These owners were mostly young boys and girls, and the goats were always happy to see them, for they were not afraid of their owners. That was the only time Peter would spend with other children. The rest of the day was spent with the animals, his sole companions. At home, Peter stayed with his mother and an old blind grandmother, but he would only spend enough time in the hut to swallow his bread and milk for breakfast and consume a similar meal at supper time. After that, he would go on to bed. He would always leave the cottage early in the morning, and at night he would come home late. so that he could be with his friends as long as possible. His father was killed in an accident some years before. He was also known as Peter the goat herd. His mother's name was Brigida, and the villagers would call her Goat Herd Peter's wife. Peter's blind grandmother was known simply as grandmother by both the young and old for miles and miles around. Data waited about 10 minutes to see if the children were coming up behind the goats. Not seeing them anywhere near, she climbed up a little higher to get a better view of the valley. She looked from side to side as a growing sense of impatience began to show on her face. The children, in the meantime, were ascending slowly in a sort of a haphazard manner, for Peter knew where to find all the good grazing places for his goats. Thus, they wandered up the mountain, moving from side to this side and to that side. The poor little girl was following the boy with a great degree of exertion, panting and straining because of her extra layers of clothing. She was so hot and uncomfortable as she climbed. Although she didn't say anything, she stared enviously at Peter, who was jumping about so easily in his light trousers and bare feet. She envied more so the goats as they climbed over bushes, stones, and steep inclines on their slender, nimble legs. All at once, sitting on the ground, the child swiftly took off her shoes and stockings. Then she untied the heavy shawl and the two little different dresses. Without any more ado, she stood up in only a light petticoat. In sheer delight over the cool relief, she threw up her dimpled arms, now dressed in short sleeves. To save the trouble of carrying the clothes, her aunt had put on her Sunday clothes over the workday garments. Arranging her dresses in a neat little pile, Heidi then joined Peter and the goats as they frolicked along the path. She was now as light-footed as the rest of them. When Peter noticed the little one in her light attire, he grinned. Looking back at the little heap of dresses on the ground, he smiled even more from ear to ear, but he never said a word. Now feeling more free and comfortable, Heidi began to converse with Peter. She had all sorts of questions for him, like how many goats he had, and where had he led them, and what did he do with them when they got there, and so forth. At last, the children reached the landing in front of the hut. When Detta saw the little party, she cried out shrilly, "Heidi, what have you done? What a sight you are! Where are your dresses and your shawl? Are the new shoes gone that I just bought for you? And where are the new stockings that I made for you? Where did you put them all, Heidi? Where?" The child quietly pointed down and said, "Over there." The aunt followed the direction of her finger and spied the little heap with a small red dot in the middle, which she recognized as the shawl. "Oh, careless child," Detta said reproachfully. "What does all this mean? Why have you taken your things off?" "Because I do not need them," said the child, not appearing in the least bit repentant of her actions. "How can you be so stupid, Heidi? Have you lost your senses?" The aunt went on in a tone of mingled vexation and rebuke. "Who is that? You must go way down there to retrieve those clothes. Who is it? It is half an hour's walk. Please, Peter, run down and get them for us. What are you doing staring at me like that?" "I'm already late," replied Peter, standing there with his hands in his trousers pockets and watching this violent outbreak on part of Heidi's aunt. "There you are, standing and staring, but that won't get you any closer to those things," said Data. "I'll give you this if you will go down there." With that, she held a 5-penny piece before his eyes. That made Peter start up, and in a great hurry he sat down the path. In a very short time he had returned, and Data had to praise him for his haste, and she gave him the little coin. He did not often receive a treasure like this. His face beaming with happiness, he put the money deep inside his pocket. "If you're going to go up to Uncle with us, you can carry the pack of clothes," said Data. They had yet to climb one more steep ascent, which lay behind Peter's hut. The boy readily collected the things and followed Data, his left arm holding the bundle and his right swinging the stick. Heidi hopped along happily by his side with the goats. After 3/4 of an hour of climbing, they finally reached the heights where the old man's hut stood on a prominent rock, exposed to every wind, but bathed in the full sunlight. From there you could gaze far down into the valley. Behind the hut stood 3 old fir trees with great shaggy branches. Further back, the old gray rocks rose high and sheer. Above them, you could see the green fertile pastures, till at last the stony boulders reached the bare, steep cliffs. Overlooking the valley, the uncle had made himself a bench which sat at the side of the hut. There he sat, with his pipe between his teeth and both hands resting on his knees. He quietly watched the children climbing up with the goats, and Data followed some distance behind them. Heidi reached the top first, and approaching the old man, she held out her hand to him and said, "Good evening, grandfather." This is where we'll stop. What happens when Heidi meets her grandfather? Click like or subscribe. Until next time.